Crabbe's Journal 19. Remember what I said about omens? Well, sometimes omens are cold and hard and easy to figure. I'd spent quite a few days moping around, feeling depressed and sorry for myself, not doing much of anything. When I awoke one morning to find 4 inches of snow had fallen during the night, it was still coming down, in fact, wet flakes undisturbed by wind. My firewood and equipment had disappeared under soft mounds of snow, and the landscape suddenly and completely whitewashed. So I had a decision to make. Very soon I'd be trapped for the winter. My exit required open water and portages that had no more than a foot or so of snow. I couldn't imagine plowing through any more than that with a canoe on my shoulders. Our little bay had a skin of ice on it every morning. It was a matter of leaving now before a real cold snap froze up the waterways completely, or staying all winter. An easy decision. But it took that snowfall to yank me out of the fog of depression I was in. I spent the morning getting fed, checking what equipment I had, and carefully studying the map. Again, I had two choices: go back the way I came, or try and work out a better route, one that was either easier or quicker. I was going to try another route. The time I spent coming down river before I fell over the falls would be doubled or quadrupled going up the other way. That current had been pretty strong, and there was still the other narrow creek after the first lake, the one I tried to learn to steer on. All that upriver travel and many portages made me shudder. So I studied the map for a long time. I could find Ithaca Camp easily enough, and there were a few possible routes, but I had to try and figure out by the contours whether I would have to travel up or down a particular river to keep my eye open for rapids and falls, and to estimate the length of portages. The length changes with the season, and so does the depth of the rapids. All that took some thought, but I put together a route that was a bit longer than my original, and I hoped a lot easier. It was late afternoon by then, and the snow had stopped. The breeze began to bend the smoke from the fire. That would mean the storm clouds might move off during the night. I searched out another of Mary's caches and lugged it out back to the fire. It was then I realized the deep snow was going to be a problem. My legs were damp from snow melting on my pants, and I knew now that winter dampness or wetness was my greatest enemy. It was impossible to keep warm if you're wet. If you stay dry and stay on the move, you can get super cold and you'll still be safe, up to a point, of course. Your body heat will keep you warm. So what I needed was leggings. Since I planned to carry only one pack, I took another and cut it up in the faded light. I made a crude pair of leggings that tied on just above my knees. Then, since I was such a wonderful tailor, I took another pack, cut 3 holes in it, and had a coat that would come in handy if I ran into a cold wind or more snow. It was just coming on light when I got up. The snow looked light gray, the line of trees almost black. I was kind of looking forward to the trip after doing nothing for so long. I tried not to look too far forward, though, to my coming back to the city. I decided to take one day at a time. I didn't bother with the fire. All the equipment was packed. Just drank some water. I kept a bottle in my sleeping bag each night so I wouldn't freeze. I munched a mouthful of the awful but nourishing stuff Mary kept in the caches: jerky, fat, and berries all pounded together into chewy bars. After a last-minute inventory, waterproof sleeping bags, tent, fly, extra clothes, food, map, compass, matches, waterproof this time, I was standing on the shore ready to go. After the canoe was loaded up, I turned and tried to work up goodbye to what had been my home for 5 months or more. But it looked so different. Snow-covered and empty. From where I stood, you could hardly even tell anyone had ever been there. It looked like just another clearing, cold and desolate. So I turned, shook the snow off my boots, and pushed out onto the lake. There's a strange beauty to the bush in winter. It was still overcast that morning, and the landscape was a blend of black, white, and sheets of gray. The lake was the color of shale and smooth. With its brightness muted without the sun, the snow was softened white, stretching away from the water. There were patches of birch along the shore. The black blotches on the white bark and dark, smaller branches brought them out of the background in sharp relief. The gray hardwood stood naked and cold. In the distance, the hills showed a faint touch of reddish-brown. The only color in the scene came from the stands of vivid green spruce and cedars that crowded together in the low places. I won't record all the details of the trip. The weather held pretty well. That's to say, it was cold, but not cold enough to lock up all the lakes. The shorelines were all fringed with ice, though. I got some light snow, some sun, a good mixture, and I made pretty good time all in all. For one thing, I had only one pack to carry. That meant one trip on the portages, because I could take both pack and canoe at one time. For another, I was in good shape, strong and able to work all day. By the morning of the fourth day, I was ready for the last leg. I had to do a portage of around 8 miles, and I'd end up on the shore of the lake Ithaca camp was on. My plan was to spend the night where the portage began and devote the next day to the crossing. The map showed the terrain to be rolling hills, challenging but nothing terrible. I got up at dawn as usual and hung the sleeping bags while I prepared a big breakfast with lots of strong tea and more food than usual. The bags have to be hung so they dry out the moisture that gathers in them during the night from your body heat and the breathing. If you don't do it, the bag will be cold the next night and never really warm up. The wind should have been a warning, but I was anxious to attack that portage. As I cooked and ate breakfast, the wind was picking up speed quickly and turning colder. You should always pay attention to the wind if you live outdoors. Sailors know that. So did I, but as I said, my mind was on other things. I had no idea I was about to walk into the teeth of the worst and earliest blizzard for years and almost kill myself in the process. I was at water level in hilly country. There's no real horizon in country like that, and the wind is cut down and deflected by the hills. Anyway, off I went, trudging through the snow in my classy leggings. I was following what was probably a fisherman's portage in summer, so, aside from the difficulties of walking uphill in snow, the going was pretty reasonable. Another thing I didn't notice early enough, though, was body temperature. Normally, a while after I started working, I'd be shedding some clothing so as not to get damp with sweat. But today I had no desire to remove anything. As a matter of fact, when I topped a hill later in the morning and put down the canoe and packed to rest, I felt colder and dug my bag coat to give some protection against the rising wind. It was bitter cold by now. My breath clouds were snatched away each time I exhaled. Around the edges of my toque, on my sideburns, the water vapor from my breath had frozen to form a rim of ice. I looked up at the top branches of the hardwood to see them waving frantically. Lots of wind up there, I thought. There was no sun in the darkening sky, a sky of deep gray with a tinge of purple in the northwest. When the snow arrived, tiny flakes whipping frantically around, I knew I was in for something. The problem was, I figured I must be halfway to the lake. It'd be crazy to turn back. So I shouldered my burdens and marched on, weaving downhill through the trees, trying not to slide. It wasn't long after that I was wearing every piece of clothing I owned. I had one pair of wool socks stuffed on my neck to make a scarf, and another on my hands. The snow was thick now, and even in the little valleys between the hills, it was swirling and driving, piling up quickly on the ground and packing into creases in my clothing. I must have looked like a ghost. I wore the compass on a thong around my neck and consulted it frequently because I couldn't see very far. I was glad my head was under the canoe, protected from the angry wind. Soon fear began to hammer at me, strengthening with every gust of icy wind. I felt that I had to keep moving so I wouldn't freeze. I knew I was still on course. But even when I reached the lake, what then? Try to cross it in a blinding blizzard? I was between two hills, high hills now, in a gully where the wind was a bit less violent. I decided to rest. Flipping the canoe off my shoulders, I dropped the pack and sat on it. No longer protected by the hull of the boat, my hands and face soon felt the sting of the wind, and I feared that frostbite was on the way. I looked around. Over on my right, about 10 yards along the gully, was a huge deadfall. A thick maple had fallen from steep bank, its roots ripped from the shallow soil, and had come to rest on a giant granite boulder. Between the boulder and the roots was a sort of cave. When I saw that, I made a quick and, as it turned out, wise decision. Animals hole up in storms, I thought. So do people when they have any sense. I lugged all my truck around to that spot. Using my paddle, I scooped out most of the snow out of the cave. There wasn't much because the big root neck, clogged with dirt, took the force of the wind. I left enough snow to make a floor by packing it down. Then I dragged the canoe to the windward side and propped it between the rock and the tree. I pulled the tent out of the pack, and using a nearly horizontal tree trunk as a ridgepole, fashioned a roof by tying the lines to the bottom gunwale of the canoe on one side and weighing down the other side with rocks. I packed snow around the little house, banking it with the paddle so no wind could enter from the ground level. I checked the thing over very carefully, walked around it a couple times, then entered on the leeward side, dragging the pack in after me. The only problem now was the snow floor would be cold. I took off my canvas pack coat, folded one of the sleeping bags and stuffed it inside, making a thick pillow. I sat down on it and leaned against the tree roots, grateful for this chance to rest. The tiny cave soon warmed up. I could still hear the wind howling and wailing snow, which meant the storm was getting even worse. The nylon roof of my cubby hole rustled and snapped, reminding me that it would need support against the weight of snow. Quickly scooting outside, I felt my way along the maple trunk, punished by the wind and blinded by the snow. I got my paddle and snapped off a few branches from the tree trunk. Back inside, I wedged the three branches between the boulders and the ground. On the canoe side, I used a paddle as a rafter. Things looked pretty secure now. I was dry, warm, and safe. Naturally, I immediately thought of food and was soon gnawing away on jerky. Water was a bit of a problem. I ate snow very slowly so as not to cool myself down too much. Once my thirst was gone, the warmth and rest made me drowsy. I soon dropped off. I dozed on and off all night, coming fully awake after daylight had arrived. Of course, the only way I knew it was daylight was to lift a corner of the nylon and push a lot of snow aside. The wind was still about its work, but it seemed less severe. There was a hell of a lot of snow out there, too. The cave felt strange, sort of oppressive, and until I pulled the nylon aside a bit, I found it hard to get my breath. That could only mean that my cave had been sealed off by drifting snow, and I had been rebreathing the air inside. I didn't want to leave the flap open. Ice air quickly sneaked in, bringing gusts of fine, powdery snow with it. But I snapped off a twig from the maple and carefully punched half a dozen holes through the roof in places where the nylon didn't quite meet the rock. A bit of light came in, enough to let me grope around and find some food. I filled a cup with snow as an experiment to see if the cave's heat was enough to melt it. Nope. Although it was pretty warm inside, enough so the nylon roof which sagged between my makeshift rafters with the weight of the snow was coated with a film of ice. I sat back against the roots and munched some food. I started to think about what I would do when I got back. I don't think I missed my parents or anybody else for that matter because they didn't. But I really had to plan. I really had no plan or many choices. Or did I? Maybe I had more choices than I thought. One thing I was sure about, I would decide. I hadn't I'd had it with living my life the way other people wanted. Mary had told me waiting around for somebody else to fix your life is a fool's game. Well, I was ready to take the responsibility. No more complaints about how hard I was done by. Hell, if I could make it out of this storm, I could handle the rest of it. That may not sound like much, but it was a start, and it gave me a good feeling. In the bush, if you don't take responsibility for yourself, you just don't last. You go home hating the place, or you don't make it back at all. Sure, it's good if you have somebody like Mary there to help you and get you ready, but when it comes right down to it, you're on your own. That was the difference between her and my parents and other adults I'd known. Mary would teach me anything, cooking over a fire, to where dry wood, where to find dry wood in a rainstorm, how not to get lost. But somehow she'd always made it clear that the reason she taught me was so I wouldn't need her around all the time. My parents were the opposite, always trying to make me dependent so they could control me. They picked my school, my career, even tried to choose my friends, then wondered why I never had any. Mary had said to me, the greatest compliment you can give a teacher, Crabbe, is to say, I don't need you anymore. Well, I figured I was ready to begin to live my life. I was healthy, strong, reasonably smart, and young. The fact I didn't have a clue what I'd do with my life didn't bother me at all, one step at a time. Having thought that, I fell asleep again.